Battle of the 14th of February had been disastrous for FAPLA. 59 Brigade had lost about 300 men killed, whilst the other brigades had also suffered heavily, especially in the failed armoured counterattack. 17 tanks had been destroyed and 32 Cubans killed during the course of the fighting. FAPLA's first defensive line had also been decisively breached. The South Africans and UNITA could now look down from the wooded Chambinga Heights and see distant Cuito Cuanavale glistening at the end of the massive open floodplain known as the Anhara Leponda. The SADF staged a river crossing of the Cuito in the hope that in their demoralized state, FAPLA would withdraw all their remaining forces from the Tumpo Triangle and defend Cuito Cuanavale. Fidel Castro was under no illusions as to how serious the situation was. After the debacle of the 14th, he immediately ordered General Sintra Frias to go to Cuito Cuanavale to take direct command of all the forces stationed there. FAPLA was only too happy for the Cubans to take over, as their front was beginning to disintegrate. Frias was an energetic and well-seasoned commander, and he soon began to put into place the Cuban battle plan. The FAPLA brigades would withdraw completely from the outer defences and concentrate on defending the Tumpo Triangle, the last remaining strip of land east of the Cuito River still held by FAPLA. This strip of land, lying directly in front of the vital Cuito Cuanavale bridge, would now become the main focus of the campaign. General Frias withdrew all his artillery to the east bank, away from the view of the South Africans. He also ordered a small force from FAPLA's 25th Brigade to dig in and defend Tumpo Triangle itself. This force was to be the bait for any South African attack. They would draw the South Africans into well-laid minefields, arranged into such a way as to expose the SADF to the full firepower of the FAPLA guns on the east bank. Frias had concentrated over 60 guns and rocket launchers on the east bank of the Cuito River. Though they lacked the range and sophistication of the South African G5s, they would outnumber the SADF artillery pieces by a ratio of 4-1, and they could put up a wall of steel in front of any South African attack. With FAPLA not falling for the ruse of the river crossing, both sides prepared themselves for the upcoming clash in the Tumpo Triangle. And whilst the ground forces prepared, the war in the air continued to escalate. On the 16th of February, the Cactus Battery engaged two MiG-21s flying over the battlefield. Two missiles were launched, one scoring a hit on the tailpipe of the MiG. Although the plane was badly damaged, it managed to limp back and land. 3 days later, the battery redeployed to the newly captured high ground overlooking the Cuito River. FAPLA patrols were looking for the vulnerable launchers, and the air defense troops had some tense moments in the thick bush. In the coming days, further MiGs were engaged without success, before the launchers were withdrawn at the end of the month. The South African Air Force continued to fly strikes across southeast Angola, in spite of the FAPLA Cuban air superiority. On the 19th of February, 8 Mirages of Foxtrot 92X flight took off to strike the SWAPO headquarters in Lubango, southeast Angola. This was in retaliation for the terrorist bombing of a bank in Oshakati. The fighters returned to Ondangwa without mishap. The morning raid had been successful, and the pilots had a quick rest before being briefed on their next strike. The ground crews meanwhile prepared the Mirages with fuel, bombs and coordinates for the second strike of the day. Four Mirages of Swordfish flight would deliver their pre-fragmentation bombs against FAPLA radars near Lukoza, west of Cuito Cuanavale. Four other Mirages struck FAPLA targets in the area, and all fighters were safely back at base in the afternoon. Road-watching teams from 3-2 Battalion had pinpointed a FAPLA convoy bringing in reinforcements and supplies to Cuito Cuanavale, and they called in the Air Force to knock it out. Four Mirages of Airwolf flight took off to strike the convoy at 5:30. Piloting one was Major Ed Every, flying his 52nd sortie of the campaign. The Mirages came in low, beneath FAPLA's extensive radar network. In the setting sun, they sighted the convoy and began their attack profile. After tossing their bombs, the pairs broke in opposite directions. Major Every could not eject in time, and was shot down and killed by FAPLA's short-range air defense systems. As FAPLA and the Cubans crawled over the wreckage, exulting in their prize and shooting this footage, an SADF Special Forces team was watching them, determined to avenge Major Ed Every. Calling in a ripple of 127 more rockets on top of the crowded soldiers, they caused heavy casualties. South African intelligence later estimated that over 100 Cuban and Angolan personnel were killed in the rocket strike. South Africa's aerial misfortunes did not end with Major Ed Every. 2 days after he was shot down, MiGs flew an airstrike against entrenched South African troops. A direct hit from a 1,000-pound bomb killed 3 SADF troops, the first fatal airstrike in months. The SADF generals were keen to attack the Tumpo Triangle as soon as possible, before FAPLA could recover from their recent setbacks and before more Cubans arrived. The general's plan of attack was ambitious and complicated. In its simplest form, UNITA would attack on a broad front, supported by 3-2 Battalion. Once the main points of resistance had been identified and the minefields marked, they would then be attacked by the mechanized forces coming up from the south. UNITA would form the bulk of the infantry for the upcoming attacks, and the SADF had trained them to operate effectively with the South African tanks. The tanks and rifles would try and stay in the tree line for as long as possible before emerging into the open of the Anharo Lapanda. The South African Air Force also had an ace up its sleeve for the upcoming battle. Mirages would fly combat air patrol over the battlefield to prevent the MiGs from interfering. Piloting one of these warplanes was Major Johannes Rankin, South Africa's leading post-war fighter ace. On the morning of the 6th of November 1981, Major Rankin shot down a Cuban-flown MiG-21 over southern Angola. It was the South African Air Force's first aerial kill since Korea. Then again, on the 5th of November 1982, Johannes Rankin again clashed with Cuban MiG-21s. In both combats, the Mirage's missiles had failed to hit their target, and Major Rankin closed in for a gun kill with the Mirage's 30mm cannon. And now, on the 25th of February 1988, if anyone was going to shoot down a MiG and wrestle air superiority back for the South Africans, it would be Rankin. The Mirages came in low over the Tumpo battlefield and immediately received a report that they were being stalked by a formation of high-flying MiG-23s. At precisely the right moment, Rankin gave the order, and the Mirages jettisoned their fuel tanks and broke into the enemy formation. Rankin maneuvered onto the tail of a MiG-23 and fired his missile. It missed, and he fired his remaining missile. It also missed as the MiGs disengaged at top speed. The cannon had never failed Rankin. It was gun time. He fired long bursts at the fleeing MiGs, but this gun camera photo is as close as he got. The MiG-23s could use their superior speed to engage and disengage at will, and so ended the South African Air Force's attempt to contest air superiority over southern Angola. The ground forces advanced along the bush line, trying to stay concealed for as long as possible. At 7:20 a.m., Commandant Mike Miller's Olifant hit an anti-tank mine. Not only did the minefield delay the attack, the explosion had allowed FAPLA and the Cuban artillery spotters to pinpoint the South Africans. FAPLA responded with the heaviest artillery bombardment of the war so far, as General Frias unleashed his Grand Battery. The MiGs attacked the stranded armoured vehicles, and the attack stalled. As the South African air defence troops responded as best they could with their inadequate weapons, they were bracketed by FAPLA artillery. Corporal Hendricks, manning a SAM-7 missile launcher, was killed in the shelling. With his attack stalled in the minefield, Commandant Miller called forward the mine-clearing plofadders. This prototype weapon shot out a long explosive sausage across the minefield, and then failed to detonate. The weapon system was so new that it failed numerous times in the campaign. After trying to detonate the line charge with 20mm fire, Commandant Miller had no choice but to order the engineers forward, on foot, to clear a path and detonate the charge manually. The engineers crawled forward under heavy fire, through the minefield until they reached the end of the explosive line charge. With the lane cleared through the minefield, the armoured advance continued. The SADF advanced across the open Anharu Lapanda and into the Tumpo base itself. The outer trenches, originally manned by FAPLA's 25th Brigade, had been abandoned without a fight. It was an old Soviet tactic: abandon the outer defences so that they become a pre-registered artillery target and you know exactly where your enemy is. FAPLA and the Cubans pounded the SADF with every weapon at their disposal. The continued presence of the MiGs overhead prevented the South African G5s from engaging in effective counter-battery fire until late in the afternoon. The FAPLA guns were relentless, and even armoured vehicles were destroyed. At 3 p.m, a Rattle received a direct hit, blowing off the door and severely injuring the crew. The Olifant tank also took a direct hit, which killed the driver before he could close his hatch. With casualties mounting and his forces under heavy fire, Commandant Miller was given permission to break off the attack and withdraw. South African artillery observers had counted 1,350 FAPLA artillery shells explode within 20 meters of the South African forces. 7 of their vehicles were knocked out. The FAPLA and Cuban forces, commanded by General Frias, had succeeded in keeping the South Africans at bay through the use of massed artillery and airstrikes. Since FAPLA relied on artillery observers to call in fire, the SADF felt that a nighttime assault against the Tumpo Triangle had the best chance of success. The objective of this second attack on Tumpo was the same as the first, namely, destroy the FAPLA forces east of the Cuito or drive it back across the river. As soon as the Tumpo bridgehead was taken, the bridge would be destroyed once and for all by UNITA and South African engineers. If that was accomplished, Cuito Cuanavale would become militarily useless. No more offensives could be launched across the Cuito, and the SADF could withdraw from southeast Angola. It all looked so simple on the maps back in Pretoria. The SADF had won victory after victory so far against impossible odds, destroying the enemy on the Lomba, driving them from the Chambinga high ground. One last little strip of land to be captured, and the generals could declare victory and bring the troops home. For the men on the ground, it did not seem simple at all. They had a number of problems to solve before they tried to tackle the formidable Tumpo defences. Chief among these problems was equipment serviceability. All South African supplies were either flown to Mavinga at night or driven up from the Southwest Africa-Namibia border. As the fighting moved further away from Mavinga and towards Cuito Cuanavale, the South African supply lines grew inescapably longer. Whilst the basics of ammunition, fuel and food got through, some of the more specialised equipment failed to turn up on time. Jacks to hoist the engines out of Olifant tanks had not arrived, and the attack had to be postponed when 11 tanks, 4 Rattle 90s, 5 G5s and 1 rocket launcher were found to be unserviceable, awaiting the arrival of spare parts. Colonel McLaughlin, the commanding officer, was adamant that the attack should go ahead with the remaining tanks and guns. Although, as further delays kept creeping in, it appeared that the forces would not be in place to conduct a nighttime attack. Delays with the mine rollers and further breakdowns meant that the attack would start at dawn, with only 11 tanks still in working order. There was strong cloud cover, however, which prevented the MiGs from bombing, and the attack went in against the FAPLA trenches. UNITA soldiers riding tanks, followed by their 3rd Battalion, led the way, with 3-2 Battalion in reserve. Things were quiet initially, apart from a MiG being brought down by a UNITA Stinger. The tanks and infantry probed tentatively forward. FAPLA had deployed their deadly 23mm once again, only now they were sighted together in batteries of up to a dozen. Their weight of fire would be enormous. The battle began as the SADF tanks and UNITA infantry charged the massed FAPLA guns. The tank's heavy armour withstood the cannon shells as the Olifants began a firebelt action, silencing the 23mm positions one by one. With the guns temporarily quieted, the tanks advanced towards the FAPLA trenches. FAPLA now opened up on the tanks stranded in the minefield, with all the anti-tank weapons at their disposal, including Saga anti-tank missiles. The South Africans were determined not to give up, however, and a furious firefight developed as the Olifants engaged their targets, supported by heavy fire from the various rifles. The enemy weapons were heavily engaged, allowing Commandant Miller to pull his forces out of the minefield and consolidate. However, by the time the regrouping was completed, only 5 Olifant tanks were still battle-worthy, mechanical breakdowns through lack of parts now becoming acute across the mechanized forces. The wear and tear imposed on men and machines had largely been a result of the politicians only committing the absolute minimum of forces. The same men and vehicles were sent in again and again against fresh enemy forces. They had always won, but now the strain was beginning to show. With the enemy fire once more picking up and the mechanized forces breaking down, Colonel McLaughlin called off the attack and ordered the troops to return to their camouflaged lagers.